So what I'm interested in is communicating to the public about geoscience, and in particular the subsurface. And one of the reasons the subsurface is interesting, as you can see here, is that this kind of feeling that we're disconnected with the subsurface, that people don't have an affinity, a cultural affinity with what's directly beneath the surface. And I think that is now really at the centre of a whole series of issues that we have with geoscience, whether it's shale gas or rad waste, or whether it's carbon capture storage, even potentially things like geothermal. So what I'd like to talk about here really is some of the ideas about how we approach that problem and what the problem actually is. So this is a survey that's been done of carbon capture storage to the public. And the point is that we actually are asking the public to look at quite complicated technical issues. I'm not going to go through all of this, but for example, if you look at the first category, the deeper you drill, the higher the pressure gets. That is a basic, fundamental aspect about geoscience. But as you can see, just about half the people surveyed actually thought that was true. And you see the implications of that when you go further down. There's a couple in the middle about how it works. The injection of CO2 is comparable to a sponge that's soaking up CO2. Well, that's the way that obviously geologists would see it. But only a quarter of the people think that. Much more believe that injecting CO2 into the subsurface is like pumping up a huge balloon underground. And of course, all it goes with that, the idea of this balloon's going to burst, and then what the ramifications of that are. And that, of course, relates to that inability to realise that the pressure gets bigger as you go down. And these we would consider basic geological facts. So how have we been getting at? Well, we've been getting at that by a project I've got at the moment with a studentship that's looking with cognitive psychology on what people think is in the subsurface. Some of it relates to down in the southwest where there's mining, and this is one quote there where someone appreciates the cultural connection to the subsurface. So down towards the very, very bottom of the earth, that's because where it's all broken down even more, and I presume that's where the heat is. It's very vague, and more so is what Hazel's been getting people to do is to try to portray the subsurface by actually drawing on a kind of physical cube that's a metre by metre by metre, but it's actually 5 kilometres by 5 kilometres and 5 kilometres, getting them to think about the subsurface. And you can see one there which has got the mine drawn in, and actually has got a lot of geology words, granite, copper, zinc. But actually, when Hazel asked them to think, well, actually, what's beyond the mine, it becomes dark and hot, and that's about it. Even in these mining areas, if you actually start to ask them about broader aspects, it becomes very vague. This one here on the left, these series of ones are, the top one is someone who's actually drawn mine buildings inside the earth because they realise that mining happened a long time ago, and there's this idea that strata builds up. And then this one here is they've not been able to comment, but they just put some rocks or some granite there, but it's all very vague. And the top one is this sense, well, there's layers, and we know there's granite somewhere down there. But again, when Hazel says, well, how far down do you get before you get to the hot stuff? The answer is, well, probably 1,000 miles deep. I don't know, I can't visualize it. And so one of the points, I think, is that there is a cultural disconnect with the subsurface. We understand it because we've been trained in it, but actually if you go to almost anyone else, they'll either have a blank canvas or they'll have a lot of misconceptions. Probably misconceptions been drawn from popular culture, movies, etc., but certainly not from geology. So one of the issues then is how do we connect to that? How do we get that information across? And that relates to the idea of how we get scientific information across generally. So here we've got the public. This is a spectrum of the public. This is down Guildford Way. I went down there looking at something to do with shale gas for news nights. But what I want to look at is think of these people as this spectrum of interests, attitudes, and values, which is what essentially the public are. And I'm going to take my inspiration from a recent 2004 study in Australia looking at public perceptions. But to be honest, it's very similar to the UK one, very similar to New Zealand, but clearly a country, Australia, where geology is very, very prominent, which is why it's interesting. And one of the things that looks at is it breaks down people on attitudes, but also on values, on their belief systems. And what we see is 4 generally category of values. So what we see here is we have four categories, and the green ones are us. They're the science fans, so-called. They're people who are very comfortable with science, got a science background, watch science documentaries. We feel they're well-versed in science. We then have the cautiously keen. These are people who are not against science, but they're maybe a little bit more distant from it. But also the cautious about it. They might be very risk-averse. We then get a category that is the risk-averse. These are people who are more worried about change. They don't like change, very conservative, and see science as a threat to that change. And when we have the concerned and the disengaged, the concerned are the people who think that science is actually probably quite bad, that its harmful effects outweigh its positive effects, or that they don't care. It's too complicated for them. They're not that interested in it. What I think is interesting is the next set of plots you'll see will show those against a number of beliefs that people have. And what I want you to look at is the green one, where the green one lies in these. What we see here is we see that actually scientists, us, our group, is the outlier. In other words, there's more connections between groups B, C, and T in terms of B, C, D in terms of their attitudes and their values than there is with us. We sit outside of the range in each of them. And yet we're the ones that feel we have the knowledge. We're the ones that want to actually communicate this. And yet we're communicating to people that by and large we don't share their attitudes and we're the belief systems. And that puts us in a very difficult position. I think the conclusions of the Australian study are really important, and there's 5 key conclusions that comes out from this study. And the first one is that when the information is complex, and they're hard to kind of digest intellectually, then what people do is they rely on their values and their belief systems. And the other thing is that because people look for affirmation of those same beliefs and attitudes, they'll search out information that more or less confirm that what they think is true, even if it's from rather obscure sources. And they're going to reject any other information that comes from other sources. Like, for example, scientists that may be saying something different to what they can believe. In fact, people most trust those people who they trust. And that means that when you ask them who you would get your information from science, it's things like friends and relatives and celebrities and things like that, people that have made some kind of connection with. By and large, it's not scientists. So that leads really to this notion that the attitudes that aren't formed by facts aren't influenced by factual arguments, or they're not been devised by logic, they're not influenced by logical arguments. And of course, one of the things that we do is we try to get our factual arguments absolutely correct and present the facts. And the conclusion really is, the fifth one is probably the most important. The public concerns about contentious science are almost never about the science. And the scientific information in that sense doesn't convey anything useful really kind of for them. In other words, it's about the beliefs and the value systems that people have and how we as scientists connect to that. And the problem, of course, is I think we don't really connect into that very well at all. We're so fixated by the science. You get a sense of that importance of values and attitudes in this quote, really, which is about earthquakes induced by fracking up north. And so this is a mother, as part of a mother and toddlers groups, talking about the process. And she said, it's where they're drilling and it like vibrates the earth and it caused earthquakes. And somebody was saying, yes, it does. It's okay. It's manageable. That was recently. My instinct went, oh, what are you doing? You know, it's not right. It doesn't feel right. So the interesting thing here is there's 3 parts to this. The first bit is the technical language is vague and incorrect. In other words, this is someone who probably knows they don't really understand the technical aspect. And then there's this somebody who says it's okay, it's manageable. That's presumably one of us. That's presumably an expert that's come onto the television, knows all this technical detail, and says exactly that. So you might expect that if someone acknowledges they don't know the technical detail, and then here's the expert coming on and telling them that they'll say, okay, that's fine, you go ahead with that. But it doesn't happen that way. What people then do is they revert back to their instinct, in other words, to their value and belief systems. And she says, it's not right. It doesn't feel right. And that's the issue. How does science deal with people who are talking about instinct and feeling? You know, we pay big money for you guys to go out and use heuristics and gut feeling at the end of 20, 30 years to make decisions based on data by saying, look, forget all that, I think it's that. Well, the ordinary public are doing it on a much smaller kind of set of experiences, but they're doing exactly the same thing. And it's usually countering the technical detail. And in my view, that's just where we get into these really controversial areas of dealing with kind of environmental risk. There's a guy, Pete Sandman, who works in the States, environmental journalist, who's worked a lot on the community reactions to environmental controversies. And he argues that in a typical risk controversy, there's always 2 elements. The first is that people overestimate the hazard. In other words, compared to the experts, they put the hazard as much, much higher than it physically is in terms of uncertainties and probabilities. And the other common element is that people are angry. They're outraged about what's going on. And according to Sandman, what he says, and I kind of agree with him, is he says, the problem is that the public often misrepresent the hazard, and the experts often misperceive the outrage. But overall, the problem is that the public cares too little about the hazard, and the experts care too little about the outrage. What that means is that if these people who are at Balcombe here are getting very upset about the prospect of shale gas, if they are angry because they've overestimated the hazard, then actually our job's pretty easy. We just explain the hazard better. We explain it clearer with better technical language and explain why it is that earthquakes, for example, or chemicals aren't a problem. But actually, much more likely is the second one, is that they're overestimating the hazard because they're fundamentally angry about something. In which case, if you explain the technicalities, that doesn't really do anything. They're still got a core anger or opposition to something. So the key thing there is that we've got to ask is why are they angry? And that might seem like something that's not a geoscience issue. It's something out there somewhere else in the social sciences, anthropology or sociology. To some extent it is, because actually there's a big research literature there that kind of helps us with this. And this diagram tries to summarize some of that with the various levels of aspects that make people angry about some of the issues. Things whether something's forced on them or whether it's voluntary, for example. Is it an industrial process or is it seen as something like natural, like radon, for example? Is it something familiar they've seen before, or is it exotic? Humans triggering earthquakes is exotic. And then, but the other side as well is towards the other side is something fair or unfair? Is the company or the people doing it, are they trustworthy or untrustworthy? And one of the ways you can evaluate that is when you raise concerns, are they responsive to those concerns or they just laugh them out of court? So the point is that in every community, and every individual has got these levels getting set by a whole set of things that are completely nothing to do with the science by and large. And that's what they're making the decisions on. And in my view, what we're doing is we're coming at it from the point of view of the science, trying to get the technical arguments across, and they're just completely missing each other. So I think that we need a new strategy for the subsurface, essentially. We need to find a way to connect people to the subsurface. This is up in north of England. What we're seeing here is a kind of old mining town. It's now a beautiful kind of tourist destination. It's got mines underneath it. Connecting people back to the subsurface culturally, getting them interested in what's underneath their feet is one part. But the second thing is that we need to stop approaching the public as educators, that there's a set of information that we need them to have. That's not the way they take on science. They take on science, they pick up bits and pieces that they're interested in, they drop it down. And fundamentally, I think we need a more human approach. We need to be, as individuals, talking to communities, asking them what they're interested in, what their fears are, what their concerns are, and then reshaping our strategies for communication based on that. Thanks a lot.